Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to our study of Paul and the letters of Paul. Tonight we're on session 11. There's only one more session to go after this, but tonight we're looking at Romans 12 and 13. And I want to just review for a minute the final piece of our schedule, which again is tonight, which you see. Next week we will not have a class because I'll be at the MCC clergy retreat, getting all my continuing education hours for the year. I think I already have enough, but anyway, I'm going. And then the final session will be on September 5th. It actually covers 3 chapters, but so much of it is review or summary of the previous chapters that I think will be okay. And so I'm going to just tip you off to this that we're going to do at the end and begin to talk about what we want to study next, so you can have that in the back of your mind during tonight, and then we will talk about it when we're finished with the lesson for tonight. As usual, I'm using Brendan Burns' volume on Romans from the Sacra Pagina series, edited by Daniel Harrington. This is a very accessible book for both clergy or biblical scholars and lay folks. Sometimes the language gets a little tangled up, but if you spend a minute or two with it, it's okay. It's easy to figure out, and they give you lots of definitions of original languages and those sorts of things that we need to understand the details of a book like Romans. One more time, I don't think I did it too often in this lesson, but if you see a quote with the letters BB after it, that means it came from Brendan Byrne. So that volume is still the best thing I know to help with Romans. So we have much fewer verses to cover in these 2 chapters than usual, so I think we'll have a little more leisure with our time and not be so rushed. So who wants to start us off? By the way, if you didn't get it, I do have handouts with the text of Romans 12 and 13 for you. Thank you. And who would like to start us off with 12, 1 through 8? And read nice and loud. I'll do it. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. For as in one body we have many members, and not all the members have the same function, so we who are many are one body in Christ, and individually we are members one of another. We have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, prophecy in proportion to faith, ministry in ministering, the teacher in teaching, the exhorter in exhortation, the giver in generosity, the leader in diligence, the compassionate in cheerfulness. And so the first theme that we encounter tonight is that I am not ashamed. And you'll see this, I am not ashamed of the gospel. I am not ashamed of what God's doing in my life. I'm not ashamed to proclaim that I'm a Christian out in the world where sometimes that's an unpopular thing to proclaim. But Paul is finished proclaiming the gospel of which he is not ashamed. He's basically given his whole version of the gospel message. And can you summarize that, anybody who's been here for the last couple of weeks? You don't want to try it if you haven't. Remember, for Paul, every point of theology comes from the center, and that center is the life, death, burial, resurrection of Christ. Anything related to theology, whether it was before that or after that, comes out from that center for Paul of the life and experience of Christ. And so he has now proclaimed the full gospel, and he's going to move now into exhortation or preaching, which makes up the entire body of the rest of the letter. This is also why it seems somewhat repetitive, because we've heard him now give all of this teaching one time, but now he's not just going to teach about it, he's going to preach it and break it down and explain it and try to motivate us to really follow it with our lives. And it is true that he sort of summons his audience to live out not individually but as community, which is one of the things we talked about, I think, last week or in one of the last 2 weeks, that oftentimes when Paul talks about the practice of faith, that he's not really talking about individual, like just my relationship with God or yours, but he's talking about communities. And so he's talking to his audience about, as a community, living out, surprise, surprise, the inclusive gospel by which they have been grasped. In other words, this message of the gospel has grabbed a hold of them and caused them to change their lives. And just program note how interesting it is to us in our experience of previous teaching about Paul being so exclusive, that the true message of Paul is an inclusive gospel that we've been grasped by. So rather than focusing on issues just specific to the Roman community to which the letter is written, Paul is focusing on issues that he knows to be both significant and common in the life of all the Gentile Christian communities who are trying to live out the gospel in the wider Mediterranean world where they live. Remember, this is new. It's a new era. We're going to hear more about that. And so everybody who believes in and follows Christ is having to work out their way of how they're going to do that in context of most of them being Jewish at one point, and now these new Gentiles who've been added to it, and the establishment of a new era that comes as folks commit to living in Christ. So Paul talks about Christian life as rational worship. And so I'm going to just break down some of the phrases in this first chapter. So life in the body as rational worship. In the first two opening sentences, Paul, again, Byrne likes this phrase, Paul summons the community to live their life together in a way that's reflective of the gospel. He tells community members to live as instruments of the gospel. And if you remember back to chapter 6, several weeks ago, we first heard that phrase, instruments of the gospel. In other words, to let Christ flow through us, to let the message of the gospel flow through us, to not necessarily depend so much on our words, but that people will see the gospel in the way we live our lives. And that's what Paul means basically when he talks about this idea of believers as living sacrifices, that we are living sacrifices to God. And just for a little illustration, a little musical example. We won't hear the whole thing, but a little bit.
Take my life, a living sacrifice, knowing it's the least that I can do. Make my life a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to you.
think that's I like the way that's set to music. But there's the word body, which Paul uses quite a bit here. We're going to talk about parts of the same body. We're all different functions of the same body. And it has several different nuances or meanings. He means, first of all, the physical body that we live in. He means material bodies. And he also includes in his image this ability to communicate with the world, ability for our bodies filled with the Spirit to communicate with the interior world, the world that's inside of us as followers of Christ, and also to compare that or to communicate that with the outside world. And we'll see in a little while a way that sort of begins to look like conscience, where we begin to through our bodies communicate with good and evil. Paul uses a lot of darkness and light imagery to know in some way what are the ways of God and what are not the ways of God. So lots of ideas underlying the word body. Living sacrifice is intentionally meant to offer contrast to the sacrifice of animals who were killed in temple worship. Remember, people outside the temple, there would be a variety of different animals that people could buy. One thing that often is overlooked in biblical scholarship, there was a value placed on the animal that you brought. If you brought a bird, it really was considered a minuscule offering because that really was all you could afford to buy. A bird might have been 50 cents. A sheep might have been $50. And whether it was implied in the religious text or not, there was this sort of caste system where people who only brought a bird were kind of looked down on, like, oh my, you're not, something's the matter with you if that's all you can afford. And they probably were treated less respectfully than the people who could come and buy a sheep or a lamb and thereby make more of an offering to the temple and get greater respect. So Paul is making a comparison of how we make ourselves a living sacrifice that is holy and acceptable to God compared to these varieties of animal sacrifices that were all somewhat holy and acceptable to God, but maybe less so to the religious authorities of the day. And that's where Paul adds to this tradition of what is an acceptable sacrifice and what is not, basically from the point of view of the prophets. A lived sacrifice, says Paul, involves the worship that we owe as rational human beings. Again, Paul is not saying that he's opposed to the idea of a traditional or material sacrifice here, but he's really focused on spiritual worship that we do, as he calls it, rational worship. That means obedience with our lives rather than adherence to specific rituals of worship. So it's more important how we live when we go outside of our worship experience than it is the details, what we do while we're together. It wouldn't be the end of the world for Paul if we missed communion one Sunday. It wouldn't be the end of the world. It probably would be the end of the world for Paul if we missed the sermon, because he certainly likes to preach. But it wouldn't be the end of the world for Paul if we omitted a reading or if we omitted maybe the community prayer. But it would be for Paul if we went out and lived in the world as if we'd never been here. So he's really focused on the act of true worship that we do outside the walls of our religious practice by living our lives under the influence of what God has done. Part of that is discerning what God's will is. And this is a part of that communication both with the inner world and with the outside world. What does it mean for us to practice our faith in our daily lives? And you all probably know this phrase from biblical references for a long time, do not be conformed to the world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your minds. And so Paul is saying, from a negative perspective, don't live like the world does. Don't adopt the world's values. Don't fall into this sin-laden condition. For those of you who might have missed a time or two, we've talked quite a bit about the difference between committing a sin unintentionally, perhaps in the exercise of just daily life, the difference between that and living in a condition of sin, where we just know we're doing wrong and we want to do it and it feels good, so we're just going to keep doing it anyway and we'll deal with God somewhere down the road. People are going to sin, but there's a difference between an existence that is in the condition of sin. It also involves the mind, the way we operate our minds. The Buddhists talk a lot about mindfulness and being in control of our thoughts and being focused. And Paul here talks about the way we think, whether we think about good things and good behavior and the ways of God, or whether maybe we're always looking for a way to get away with a little detour. Are we thinking, well, I can probably be okay with God, and God will probably let me get away with this, and sort of that manipulative kind of thought. And Paul is saying, keep our minds focused on the ways of God, and to discern what it means to be a human person living in the ways of God. He insists that this new moral life to which Christians are committed proceeds from this renewed inner faculty of discernment. It proceeds from this ability to have this conversation with ourselves about, well, maybe I have these two choices. I could do this or I could do that. I could get away with this, but I probably should do this. And so for a believer who's internalized this moral or ethical way of living, or a moral code that comes from relationship with God, Paul is suggesting that we work really hard to focus on, as often as possible, making the best choice rather than, and maybe less good but somehow still acceptable choice. He says that the Christian life or Christian obedience is absolutely focused on a constant conquest for God's will, not in general necessarily, but specifically for this moment in time. Is it God's will for me to do this or to do this right now in the here and now? And Paul is suggesting a focus that's so committed and so in tune that it really does apply to the present moment in every moment. That is, this is not from Byrne or from Paul, but it's very similar to the Buddhist idea of mindfulness, that I'm focused on what I'm doing, I'm focused on my purpose, I'm focused on the direction that I'm going, I'm focused on living in a way that offers the most benefit and the least destruction to all things that God has created. And so you see an overlap there between the thinking of one religion and another. Paul, interestingly, this might sound really far-fetched, but the text makes it clear that Paul really does think humans are capable of this. He's not stretching, he's not suggesting this is something we should try for that's really impossible, but his language indicates that he really believes that human beings, human minds, under the influence of the Spirit, really can do this. He thinks that this bodily obedience that flows out of this kind of discernment, or as we saw before, conversation within ourselves, is that continual sacrifice that is pleasing to God. So in some ways, to put it in a nutshell, we give up the idea of self-will run riot in favor of living according to God's will for our lives. And that is the sacrifice that we give back to God. Why? Because of what God has sacrificed and given to us. And so this is my phrase now: a continuous walk with God that includes open communication that helps us discern what it means to make our lives a living sacrifice or to walk in God's ways. That is what Paul is trying to elicit from his hearers in Rome at the time. So there are some basic demands of Christian living that Paul talks about. And he holds back just a little bit about the gift that has been given to him. But I wish Kat were here, because this is the part of Paul that drives her crazy. He still makes it abundantly clear that he's the one who's been charged by God to be the apostle. He's the one responsible, and he's the one who should get credit for establishing and pastoring all these Gentile churches. It's another moment where Paul gets in the pulpit, proverbial pulpit, and proclaims, me, by the grace of God. So, we both love him and can't stand him sometimes, and he's back in that mode again. But by virtue of that gift, it is true that Paul makes an appeal in strongly personal and authoritative terms. He is, to some extent, right about his role in setting up these churches and being the apostle or the teacher or the overseer to the development of these churches, even though maybe he seems to enjoy stating that just a little too much. He tells them to adopt a right mind. In other words, he's cautioning here really strongly again against developing this holier-than-thou attitude, or this approach that says that I'm better than you, or my faith is better than yours, or we're the only way and you're the wrong way, or this way or the highway, and to think in ways that lead to sober, and what the text means by that is informed and realistic thinking, a sober understanding, an informed understanding, a realistic understanding of what the ways of God actually are. There's a lot of warning in here about haughty attitudes or getting too full of ourselves, and it is kind of paradoxical because that's one of the faults of Paul in his presentation. That almost in every section that we study, there's a moment where he goes back to it's all because of what God's doing through me, and so he's telling us to avoid what he's doing. This is not just a specifically Christian value. It traces back to Greek philosophy of the day and suggests a sort of what I call the Julia Child's approach of all things in moderation. Don't get too carried. Be proud of what God's doing for you, but don't get too carried away with it. Claim your place in the kingdom of God, but don't get too carried away for it. All things in moderation. So if you want some butter, have a little bit, but not too much. Our assessment of ourselves comes out of the ways we perceive ourselves in relationship with God in basically three aspects of it. Are we really doing our best? And I'm saying these are questions that we can ask ourselves to make our own self-assessment. Are we really doing our best to walk in the ways of God? Are we trying really hard? Maybe we're really messing up, but are we really, really trying? Or have we tried and failed so many times that we've just sort of thrown in the towel? This is the way I will tell you, when I was really large, before I had my weight loss surgery, there's a moment in that context where I said, I've tried so hard, I've done everything out there in the world, it's all failed, so this is the way it's going to be, and I threw in the towel for a moment. And Paul is suggesting that this might be a place where believers find themselves after having tried really hard to follow or live in the ways of God and just failed so badly that they gave up. Or the third condition might be that even though at a point we believed in God, that we got tired of trying to change our behavior and we decided that we wanted what we want when we wanted it. And as 12-step programs refer, we became cases of self-will run riot. That we're just not going to do this anymore. We're going to do, maybe God doesn't even exist, and therefore we're just going to do what we want to do or do what feels good. And the basic question for us, and this assessment, which is suggested by Paul, is this: what gifts have we been given by God, and how are we going to use them? Are we going to use them in an ongoing attempt to measure up the best we can to God? Are we going to use them to a point and then give up and throw in the towel? Or are we just going to say, to heck with whatever God has planned for me, I'm going to live the way I want to live? That's the basic assessment that Paul is talking about. And then he shifts again into this community perspective about living as a body. And this is not unique to Christian thought either. This is a metaphor that's been used in the ancient world and in other religious thought. This idea of body would have been very familiar to Paul's audience wherever they came from. And by body, he means the inner workings of a human group, or even not just a state, but like the inner workings of a city or a county or a state or even a country. Believers are not just like a body, not just a comparison to a body, but they actually form a living body or a living entity, which has a wide diversity or variety of gifts. And so in this image, what Paul suggests is that every limb, there's also this idea of a tree here, but every limb on the tree functions with respect to every other limb. The actions of one limb or one body part impacts all the other limbs or all the other body parts. In other words, if I, in some moment of insanity, chop off my little finger, it doesn't just affect the finger, it doesn't just affect the hand, but the now decreased function of that hand means that all of the rest of my body is going to have to work to compensate for that. And so that's what Paul's saying. Every action impacts all the other bodies. And then he moves to a discussion of what's a common theme for Paul? Gifts. What kind of gifts? Spiritual gifts, or gifts that come in the Spirit. I might have to wake you all up here in a minute, so be careful. Gifts. So there's a list of gifts that come here. And I've tried to break them down into easily understandable definitions here. The first gift is prophecy. By the way, there's quite a bit of overlap in some of these. Prophecy, in what I think is a simpler definition, is the ability to discern and declare God's working, that should say in various events, and God's will for the community. So to be able to identify where God is working in a community and to discern what God's will is for that community. So if I put on my prophet hat for just a moment, I would say something like, it is God's will for Trinity Metropolitan Community Church to be the most inclusive church in the Gainesville community. Our doors are open to everybody. And I'm just absolutely sure that that is the case. So that would be a word of prophecy. Now, the charisma that comes with that is the way in which the prophet proclaims that message so that it invokes people to believe it and to follow it and to work for it, and it enhances the faith of other believers so that they'll come toward it too. It's that Pied Piper quality that causes people to buy into the mission or to come and join in because they believe it too. So a little overview of prophecy, which involves the ability to analyze what the will of God is, to know when the will of God is occurring, and to inspire people to join in to work for that purpose. And then service is listed. And the simplest way to break that down is to say those who perform various acts for the benefit of the community are doing service as part of their spiritual discernment. Some people can preach and inspire and be very charismatic, and some people can go around doing all kinds of things quietly that are of service to the community, and thereby their spiritual discernment shows that to them as their way of supporting the mission which is outlined and proclaimed by the prophet. These are wonderful people who never want to, or seldom want to be in the spotlight, who don't care if their pictures in the e-talk or on the website or wherever, but they just want to do their part. And there are people around here, I can tell you, that just quietly come to the office and do something on the computer. And there's people that show up in the middle of the week and work on the grounds and specifically don't want me to tell people they've done it. These are those people who have the gift of service. Then there are the teachers, who are people who explain and model the life of faith for people right after their initial conversion. This would be like in some churches when somebody's baptized, we assign a sponsor to them. And the sponsor would be the one who's first responsible, but with the community, to teach that new believer about the ways of God, about how to implement faith into their life right after they've just gotten started. And then there are exhorters, and these overlap quite a bit with the role of prophecy. They are people who display charisma by promoting the implementation of ethical teachings of the gospel in everyday life. So it might not be somebody who's the prophet or the pastor or the person in highest focus, but it might be somebody who really gets a hold of the message and then goes throughout the community. Well, this is what we've been hearing, this is what's been preached, this is what's been taught. Let's really take that and model what we do as a community on the teaching and preaching that we're hearing. This would be somebody, again, who inspires people because of their charisma to follow their example as they follow maybe the prophet's example or God's example or Christ's example. People who encourage others to and role model for others how it is that we live in the ways of God. There are 3 other gifts listed, and every one of them involves charity, or in some ways what we interpret as love or Christian service. And so first, we have this image of a person who's well off, who provides assistance for others. And the key point here for Paul is that person who's showing that Christian charity has to examine what her or his motives are for doing so. There's a difference between a person who shows Christian love and assists people just so they themselves can be lifted up. Oh, look what Mrs. Jones is doing for those poor children. It reminds me, I was on a trip to a mission trip to Central America, and they specifically took us to a school that was in session with a group of obviously darker skinned children for a photo op. And to me, it was nothing but let's all go get our pictures taken with these poor, impoverished children so we can send them home and show them what we're doing over here. Thankfully, I had a moment of inspiration and refused to go in the classroom. And it was so contradictory to that whole ethical kind of, you do it because you're called to do it, not so you can send home a picture of yourself on the internet with the poor children. So it just went against me, and some people did it and some people didn't. The second area of focus is on one with influence or position who provides assistance for another, and that person needs to show his or her dedication to the cause. It's not just because one person, if I'm concerned about the hungry, in other words, if we are, we're not going to just be about the hungry who maybe go to church here. We're going to be about hungry people that show up at the door that we don't know. We're going to be about hungry people who don't embrace our message at all, but show up at the door because they're hungry, and we're still going to feed them regardless of whether they endorse our thinking or not. So this is just hunger as an example of our dedication to a cause of feeding the hungry without qualification. Okay, so that's an important value. A third is one who brings relief to the unfortunate or exercises mercy must do so with cheerfulness or with this charisma that indicates that they are performing service as a privilege, not as a burden. I saw somebody actually that I know on Facebook today who it just felt like they were moaning, time to go feed the hungry again. Well, stay home. You know, you don't have to don't get on Facebook and make it drudgery that you're going to go feed the hungry. You know, if that's what you're called to do, go feed the hungry and be happy about it. Be happy for the opportunity to do that Christian service. And seriously, if it causes you that much misery and discomfort, stay home. There's other people that'll go feed the hungry, and it reminds me of one of my MCC colleagues. God loves a cheerful giver, but she'll take it from a grouch. Well, if you're going to be grouchy about it, in my opinion, just stay home because somebody else will come. You know, because people pick up on that. If I'm somebody if we had a big feeding program here and I just gave every person that came to the door the devil before a really hard time, before I let them get the food, be cheerful about it. You know, if you can't do it with a cheerful heart that represents the way God has blessed you, then maybe you need to find a different ministry. So Paul is endorsing doing this kind of service, even acts of mercy, with a cheerful heart that flows out of the privilege that we've been given by God to offer that service. All 7 gifts cited are used to highlight the way each member exercises her or his own distinctive grace for the benefit of the community. And it has to be done in a graceful way and a loving way that shows 2 things. Number 1, that the member who's exercising that has great value to the community, and equally important, that the person who receives the service has equal value to the person who gives the service. It doesn't set up, we are so good that we have all this stuff to give to you poor people. It means that we are equals, that we exercise our gifts because God has given them to us, and we are so thankful for these people who come to offer us the opportunity to live out the gifts God has given us. Equals, not one better than the other, not one higher than the other, not one more powerful than the other, not one more important than the other, both equals because we serve equal purposes in the kingdom of God. So an important way to look at that. Let me just stop for 1 minute. Any questions or comments there before we move to the next section? Okay. All right, who'd like to read verses 9 to 16 or part of it? Just jump in.
Let love be genuine, hate what is evil, hold fast to what is good. Love one another with mutual affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not lag in zeal, be ardent in spirit, serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope, be patient in suffering, persevere in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints, extend hospitality to strangers. Bless those who persecute you. Bless those and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Do not claim to be wiser than you are.
This is where the Christian rubber hits the road, huh? This is the tough part. Love never fails. And Paul's going to really work us over now on love, or a true Christian love. Love in action in the community. And these qualities are sometimes described as the oil that ensures a smooth and fruitful interaction within the community. The oil that quiets the squeaky wheel, that helps us to live peacefully and in love with each other. Love heads and governs this entire sequence. It is the theme of the sequence. It governs everything that Paul is talking about here. And this idea relies on a wide variety of historical material with which the hearers would have been familiar. It comes from Greek phrases that would have been common to most of the people in the time and in the setting. It has Semitic or Jewish prototypes. It is included in Old Testament passages. It is part of Greco-Roman philosophy, and it also has close parallels in other parts of the New Testament, in 1 Thessalonians and in 1 Peter. All that to say, this language would have been very familiar to the people who were hearing what Paul had to say. Genuine love rules the life of the community. Now, we're going to talk about agape, which is what? Do you remember? Agape? Friendship love, godly love, refers primarily to God's love for humankind. And so now Paul adds another word to it. And again, I apologize for my southern pronunciation of the Greek language, but Paul now uses agape anipokritos as a quality of genuine love, not just from God to humankind, but from believers between each other. This is the kind of love that causes me, as you're my Christian sister or brother, so I love you. I love you with God's love. This is the love that agape asks of believers, which represents the outflow of their one lives of the same divine love shown by God to them. I love you out of the love that God has shown to me in the divine example of love. And it's not just that flippant kind of I love you, but it's a sincere I love you. I'll back you up. I'll look out for you. I got you back in times of trouble. I'll celebrate with you in good times. It is a real, not just I love you, but I love you, and I mean it, and I'm willing to back it up with action. Why? Because it is inspired by God's love that was backed up in the action of Christ. It's not just, English betrays us because we only have one word for love, and it means I love my little speaker here, and I love my partner of 19 years. It's not the same thing, but we're trapped because we only have one word for it. But this is the love that is inspired by the love of God as displayed by the action of Christ. The kind of love that says, if the bad guys are coming to get you, I'm going to surround you with good. I'm going to back you up. I'm going to get your back. If difficulty is coming your way, then I'm going to do my best to alleviate the difficulties. I'm going to share what I've got with you. I'm going to share what I've learned in my own experiences of difficulty. If you're hungry, come eat at my table. If you're thirsty, come drink some of my water. Or if you're homeless, come spend the night at my house. If you need clothes, well, I got lots of clothes in my closet. Come get a few of them. It's that kind of love that demonstrates, not just talks about, the concept of good over evil, the concept of bounty in times of deep despair. And that is exactly what Paul means by genuine love. It's not just a word, it's an action. Sometimes you hear people say love is a verb. It's not just, a noun. So love is not passive in this case. And not only does it respond to opportunities that present themselves, but this kind of love goes out and looks for opportunities to express itself as a sign of the work of the Spirit in a believer. I love what Burns says here. Persons whose love, quote, has been fanned into flame by the Spirit become aglow with the Spirit when they are able to live out this kind of love. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine, that kind of love that causes it to glow in us. And then Paul takes it a step further by suggesting that this sort of love doesn't just occur in our community or in our family or in our group of believers that believe the way we do, but it actually extends beyond our own community in this very solid Hebrew Bible, Old Testament and New Testament value of hospitality that we show to people within our community and that we show to the stranger, and even that we might show to somebody who's perceived to be our enemy. And remember, when, for example, missionaries or preachers like Paul were traveling in ancient times, you couldn't just call up the Red Roof Inn or the Holiday Inn or La Quinta or Homewood or Hilton or some of those people. They were really dependent on the hospitality of people in the communities to which they traveled. And Paul actually encourages them to, as part of their calling, to live into the experience of trusting that they will be received with hospitality wherever they go. It's an important theme. And then it also extends out to those who persecute us. Paul feels that this feels intrusive to us in the midst of an expose on love. Let's talk about how much we love each other. We love our family. We love our church families. And all of a sudden he says, oh, by the way, love the people that persecute you too. Love for us, maybe the Fred Phelps of the world. Love the Pat Robertsons. Love the Jerry Falwells. Love that thing over in town whose name I won't mention because I'm afraid of giving them credibility, especially because this is going to be on the internet. But love the ones that make you want to give up the name Christian because of their behavior. Love the people that persecute you. Why? Because it reflects the sense of difficulty that it really is for us to embrace this kind of God love that flows in the most difficult situation of all, in God's action through Christ, who came to show us how deep God's love for us. This kind of love, which is required of believers, most closely resembles the kind of love that God showed through us and that we received from God through the example of Christ, who came to us from God. Now, the next phrase that we want to break down is sympathy in all circumstances. And this also comes from the Jewish or the Semitic tradition, wisdom tradition. It also includes insiders, people in the community, and outsiders. So we have sympathy for people, or we have understanding for people in our core group, and we have this sort of agape love in action for people outside of our group too. It calls for this basic principle again of what Paul calls a sober reckoning of oneself, a sober assessment of who we really are, both individually and as members of a specific community and as members of a larger community. Again, to transfer a little bit into Buddhist thought, for the good of all creation. I do what I do not just for myself and not for my community, but for the good of all creation. This kind of mindset, Paul suggests, requires action. It requires us to demonstrate it through action. And it also highlights that a legitimate diversity of views can be encompassed within a wider aspiration of unity. In other words, we can all come together I'm sure that I have somewhat different thoughts about situations than you might, but our thoughts are similar enough that we can come together and accomplish what we do, or accomplish our mission in Christian unity, while honoring the fact that we're never going to think alike. We're never even called to think alike. We're never even called to believe alike in the great details of it, but that we have this unity of mission that causes us to work together as one body for love in action in the community. So, some basics. Don't get too full of yourself. Don't think all these haughty thoughts about being better than, or more important than. Don't get too full of yourself. Make a realistic assessment of who we are. Associate with people who are perceived as the lowly. Don't just isolate with one peer group, but associate with all kinds of people. Spend time with the poor and with the disadvantaged and those who are on the margins or who are labeled outsiders, even those who in the world view might seem to have no value whatsoever. Why? Because just always remember that the least of these have supreme value to God. The last really will be first. The lowest really will be the highest. And so we want to know people who are labeled this way, because we want to be a part of them when they are elevated. And I don't even like the language when I say we want to be a part of them. We want to be one with, together, so that we all are elevated in the kingdom of God. Don't become too wise in your thoughts as a community, Paul says. And this comes directly from the Hebrew Bible in Proverbs 3, verse 7. It is something that makes this becoming too wise, or developing this idea that we know it all, makes us resistant to the ongoing revelation of the plan of God, which surpasses what we can understand. In other words, if we already think we know it all, and that we've heard it all, and that God has revealed everything to us, then there's a high likelihood that we're going to miss it, because God's not finished speaking yet. As the Church of Christ says so nicely, God is still speaking. And so if we get too full of it, we just miss the ongoing revelation that God is doing, that God did in the Hebrew Bible and in the times of the New Testament, and that God is still doing, because God's not finished yet. In verses 7, I'm going to rush a little because I'm talking way too much about these brief verses. So verses 17 to 21 basically tell us not to repay evil with evil. I love the way this cartoon illustrates it. The Sunday school class, and the child says, "We're supposed to love our enemies? Is this some kind of Zen thing?" Well, yes, it is. It is some kind of Zen thing, and it is also a calling from God for us to even love those enemies. It's focused on a theme of non-retaliation, which also draws from the wisdom traditions of Israel and from the teachings of Jesus. The truth is, vengeance is mine, says the Lord. That Christians are not to repay evil for evil in the sight of all, no matter how somebody has treated us in the past. We're supposed to work to do what is honorable. Paul really has this view that the Christian life is a drama. It's a play. It's high drama in our community, amen, that's played out on a worldwide stage for all to see. So if we retaliate with evil when we're treated badly, how is that different from the way everybody else acts? If we go enact vengeance on people who are ugly to us, how is that different from anything else? How does that show the influence of God on our lives? And so Paul is constantly urging us to develop these thoughts again. We're going back to this mindset of thinking thoughts that are noble, so that our actions will also be noble, and they will enable us, the noble thoughts and the noble actions that flow from them enable us to achieve this desire to live peaceably with all people and with all of God's creation. Paul does understand that this is not always going to happen, that it does require some cooperation from both parties. It means, if you're going to come after me, I'm going to try to treat you well, but if you keep coming after me and keep on coming after me, I'm never called to be a doormat. It does, I can defend myself verbally. I can defend myself with good theological training. Even ultimately, I can defend myself physically if I need to. I don't have to just stand there and let somebody annihilate me. But what Paul is saying is to act nobly if possible, so far as it depends on me, as far as I'm able to, as far as that person out there will allow me to always act nobly and to leave vengeance to God. This very much reflects this eschatological or end times punishment that God will enact on those who live in evil ways. It comes from a long-standing biblical tradition. It also comes from non-biblical prohibitions against human beings taking vengeance into their own hands, from other holy literature, from other holy paths. And there is this idea that God might choose not to enact vengeance on them, because the choice to enact vengeance is entirely a prerogative of God. God can do vengeance on people, or what have we experienced before? We talked ad nauseum about this. The grace and the mercy of God. We did not earn anything God did for us. We were recipients of the gift of God's grace and mercy. And if God is graceful and merciful with us, then God just might choose again to be graceful and merciful even with our enemies. And that can be a hard pill to swallow. And that's why God is God, and maybe we're not sometimes. What is required of us is absolute and true confidence in God, that we try to live peacefully, that we're not offensive to people, that we try always to overcome evil with good. And I love the way Professor Byrne sums this up in this quote: "In the face of a world that is frequently hostile and bent upon inflicting evil, believers could well allow that evil to triumph radically by allowing evil to emerge from their own hearts in the shape of revenge, instead adopting the active stance just mentioned, the call to allow goodness to triumph over evil." So vengeance is God's. Our calling is to do our best to allow goodness to triumph over evil. What Paul requires of believers is an outworking of their renewed mind, that they allow their preset, that should be present bodily existence, to become the vehicle of divine agape love that works the reconciliation of all humanity to God. So, wow, that took a lot longer than I thought it was going to. It seemed like it flew by when I was working on it. Any questions, discussion? Live peacefully with your neighbor because of the influence of God's love on your life. It's sort of a one-sentence summary. Let's keep going. We'll have more time at the end. We got to finish this next whole chapter.
Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whosoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you wish to have no fear of authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive its approval. For it is God's servant for your good. But if you do what is wrong, you should be afraid, for the authority does not bear the sword in vain. It is a servant of God to execute wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore one must be subject not only because of wrath, but also because of conscience. For the same reason you also pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants, busy with this very thing. Pay to all what is due to them, taxes to whom taxes are due, revenue to whom revenue is due, respect to whom respect is due, honor to whom honor is due.
So let me just say, this is a favorite passage of government, and sometimes a least favorite of people who are subject to the government. But it talks a lot about civil authorities, and Uncle Sam there. Duties toward civil authorities. This is probably one of the strangest and most controversial passage of the entire letter, and here are some reasons why. Basically, it doesn't match up with anything that comes from Paul anywhere else. It has no appeal to Christology, which is, again, everything in Paul's theological world flows out from Christ. This doesn't. There's nothing specifically Christian about what he has to say here. It lacks the Pauline focus on the present era which is passing away. It has no hint of eschatological or end times thought processes. The suggestion that only evil doers have anything to fear from the government contradicts the reality and his earlier discussion of believers who have been, quote, done to death all day long by governmental authorities. It's like this just dropped out of a different Paul. However, there's some reasons why it might be included, and here's just a couple of possibilities for us to think about. It could be a plausible historical setting, because of a plausible historical setting that can be found in civil unrest among the populace of Rome that came to a head in the late 50s, probably around like 58, centering on abuses in collection of taxes and other issues. So it could be there because it really does have documented historical context. Another reason for its inclusion offers a corrective to any impression that the gospel proclamation of the onset of a new age implied freedom from any obligation to rule and authority belonging to the present era. In other words, it could say, just because something new is coming doesn't mean you can already give up your allegiance to what is still in place. So, two potential reasons. Let's look at it. Verse 1 states the basic instruction: be subject yourselves to these people. 1b through 2a offer a theological underpinning for the command. Behind earthly rulers, Paul says, lies the implied authority of God. 2b states the theme of a second supportive argument that is developed further in verses 3 to 4. Through subjection to authorities, one avoids the punishment that they still have the power to inflict, as instruments of God. Verse 5 restates the initial instruction, be subject, and introduces the idea of conscience. Be subject because you know it's the right thing to do. There's that little voice inside you that tells you you should follow. And then verses 6 and 7 commend the paying of taxes, which is probably intended to be the climax of the passage. In other words, the most important part of it. Byrne offers some interesting thought in a long series of reflections on this passage. And I just thought some of this is a summary that I've put together from paragraphs of writing. But let me just share this with you. To modern sensibility, the extraordinary measure of divine guarantee attributed here to earthly rulers is naive and simplistic in the extreme. No allowance is made for the abuse of power on the part of human authority, nor is there any thought that on occasion it is good to feel the brunt of penal sanction through either mistake or overt miscarriage of justice. In such situations, the text loses all relevance. The assertion that all authority, including civil authority, ultimately derives from God requires a great deal of nuance. The text does preserve the valid reminder that no government is a law entirely to itself. So, yes, government is put into place by God, but not every action of government is a godly action. We know, even in this year, that people, the overwhelming evidence against whom has been discredited and made into basically non-evidence, who from all outwardly appearances seem to be innocent despite an earlier judgment of guilt, have still been killed by governments under capital punishment. It's hard to call that a godly action. We know people who still are discriminated against by governments, our community, for example, in failure or refusal to give equal civil rights to one group as those that another group enjoys for no special reason. And it's hard to call that a godly action. We know that in our own penal system, the overwhelming majority of people who are on death row are minorities, poor minorities, and the statistics just don't add up, that overwhelming percentage of crimes punishable by death would come from that large a statistical minority of the population. Maybe it's hard to call that godly. And still, governments are set up to bring about some sense of society, some sense of civility, some sense of a way that we can all live together without killing each other. There's both, and so what Byrne is implying that it would be naive for us to believe that every action of a governmental power or a civil authority is specifically ordained by God, and the fact that they are there in those positions probably still is an example of the fact that God has placed government in that place. Does that make sense? Not every action of is specifically godly, but the fact that they are there has a godly endorsement.
Yeah, you think of Syria and all those poor people.
Yes. Syria, Nigeria, and also the U.S. I mean, this is not just out there somewhere. It happens here too. Not to the extent, certainly, Dottie, of Assyria. But, so government is put in place by God, and not every action of government is necessarily endorsed by God or viewed as godly behavior. Interesting thought. Verses 8 to 10. Somebody read us through there.
Owe no one anything except to love one another, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. The commandments: you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law.
Verse 8 always reminds me of one of my Baptist seminary colleagues, and he was struggling really financially to get by. And I remember one day he didn't have money to eat lunch, and I'm like, well, let me just buy you lunch. And it was cheap in the seminary cafeteria, not like it is in Boston. but in New Orleans it was. Anyway, he wouldn't even let me buy his lunch, and he starts quoting this to me. The Bible says, "Owe no man," and I'm not even going to owe you for a lunch. I said, "Well, all right, be hungry then." But anyway, it's just that sometimes people take it to the extreme. But Paul is back to love again. And I think it's important, and I call it bracketing, to notice how this weird section in the middle is bracketed on the front by discussion of love, agape love, and the agape love demonstrated through humankind. And then we have the weird section in the middle, and now he comes right back to a discussion of love again. I really think that middle section is the work of Paul. I'm not suggesting that it's somebody else's that was dropped in there, but it was almost like a bipolar episode or something. It just doesn't match. It's like he woke up on a different side of the bed that day, or maybe some event occurred that had him thinking about the government. But anyway, he goes from that right back into his traditional theme of love, which I said that already, so we'll skip it. No part of Christian life stands apart from the core value or the requirement of love. This passage also, in contradiction to what we've probably been taught in the past about Paul, reflects an inclusive structure with the dominant theme of love as the fulfillment of law. Love for your community, love for outsiders of your community, love for people who follow the ways of Christ, love for people that in your perception don't necessarily follow the ways of Christ. Why love? Because it is the sole debt that we owe for what God did for us. God loved us, and our way to repay that debt is to love each other. Christians are not exempt. Love is not something we can run out of. It is inexhaustible. And the debt of love that we owe is also inexhaustible. It's not like I'm getting ready to be 39. I'm getting ready to have a birthday not too long from now, a few months from now. And I can't say that because I'm this old and I've been trying my best to love people for all these years that I'm done with it. I can't say I've paid the debt of love that I owe, because of the extreme way that God showed us, the way God loves us. It becomes like an inexhaustible debt of love that we owe because of what God did for us, even in the most difficulty and unlovely of circumstances sometimes. And in Paul's view, remember, he always has these Jewish antagonists in the audience challenging what he has to say. In Paul's view, living into this love, this requirement of love, this inexhaustible debt of love, in some way fulfills the law. Paul says plainly that when paid, the debt of love fulfills the ethical requirement of the law, and that it is sufficient for what the law requires. And so in some way it shows us that Paul now clearly believes that believers are not under all those rituals that come from the law, the ritual sacrifices, not necessarily, all of those clean and unclean, and all of that is ritual, but that believers still are under the ethical values or the ethical standards of the law that are still in place regardless of whether Christ has come or not. Those ethical values had not changed. And so let's read another section, verses 11 to 14. Besides this, you know what time it is, how it is now the moment for you to wake from sleep, for salvation is nearer to us now than when we became believers. The night is far gone, the day is near. Let us then lay aside the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us live honorably as in the day, not in reveling and drunkenness, not in debauchery and licentiousness, not in quarreling and jealousy. Instead, put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. knowing the time, or what time is it? Paul begins this entire section with an eschatological theme. Again, these believers really thought that this second coming was going to happen like tomorrow, next week, maybe in a month or two, certainly not so many years later. So he's in that mode now. He appeals to eschatology, or the study of end times, to strengthen the exhortation. This happens not only in Paul, but it's widespread throughout the New Testament. He encourages people to recognize what time it is. And Paul is talking about now a time of overlap between the old age and the new age that is to come. And so how are we to behave or conduct ourselves in this overlap when outwardly the old age is still in place, but inwardly, or through the eye of faith, which discerns in the resurrection of Jesus and the gift of the Spirit, that this new age is dawning, that will bring about a total transformation, not only of relationships, but also a total transformation of world systems. Paul uses the image of sleepwalking, or somebody who walks in their sleep in the early morning hours, or on the onset of dawn, and he says, wake up and adjust to the reality of the new day that's about to dawn. As usual, Paul's word salvation has a little bit of a negative connotation to it. It implies this idea of being rescued from the wrath of God in the final moment, or in just as you're about to get it, you're rescued from the wrath of God. Positively, however, it means to the moment where we live into the full blessing of God. And he talks about the clothing, appropriate clothing for the day. Wake up, not just wake up, but change your clothes. Get out of your pajamas and put on something that looks decent. Take off the works or the clothes of darkness. Change your behavior. Put on the armor of light. Night and day and dark and light are images that are all throughout biblical literature. Again, Hebrew Bible, New Testament. But when you're armed in this way, you're awake, you have on the clothing of righteousness, you will survive the trials of the present time no matter what comes against you. Evil forces will make a final attempt or onslaught before good takes over, before they are overcome in the ways of God. This comes from Mark 13. Remember, Mark, we think, is the first gospel to have been written, or the gospel written closest to the actual life of Christ. And Paul says to gird ourselves for battle as an urgent matter. Put on this cloak of righteousness. Be prepared, be awake, be ready for whatever's coming. And then he talks about conduct becoming of the day. And again, daytime behavior tends to be more decent in Paul's view because everybody can see what you're doing. And nighttime behavior can sometimes be a little different, or a little shady, as we call it, because it's hidden by darkness. And then he lists some works of darkness which appear to be specifically directed at the behavior that's going on in Rome at the time. And he tells people to put on a pattern of life appropriate to those that recognize that they are living in the dawn of a new day that's going to be ushered in by Christ. He says, put on Christ. And again, it's referring to Greek drama there, where they would put on a costume or a garment that was it covered hands, arms, face, covered everything. So the person, the actor, was completely undistinguishable. They had abandoned their own character or their own personhood for a moment to become that character. And Paul is saying, put on Christ that way, so that it overcomes or influences everything that you are, both outwardly and inwardly, and it shows that you are, as believers, radically conformed to the ways of the risen Christ. Live in Christ rather than in the flesh. Remember that flesh is vulnerable to sin and sometimes hostile to God, and the ways of the flesh lead to death, and that believers will be tempted to fall back into these attitudes. But in these overlapping times, overlapping ages, believers really can live lives dominated by the Spirit. And this is once again a moment where Paul really believes that it's possible for believers to do this. He really believes that believers can develop a godly mindset, and he believes that believers can adopt godly behavior because the Spirit gives us the capacity to resist the impulses of the flesh. The Spirit gives us the capacity to resist the temptations of the darkness and to live in the light, so that they don't give us a great tendency to succumb to evil desires, but they help us be able to live a life that's representative of the new era that's to come. I always want to throw in a cautionary thing here. I like to be very careful in public settings about how I use this language of dark versus light. For some people, just as a freebie from me, for some people, this can have racial overtones. And I don't think Paul intends for it to, but there's so much concern about, dark versus light, and is white better than black. And so if you ever find yourself talking about this, just be aware that for some people, this whole discussion of light being better than dark can have racial overtones. So my method is just to own it and to say clearly that in no way do I think white is better than black or light is better than dark, but it is the imagery that Paul uses in the Bible, so we have to deal with it in its context. But for him, it did not have racist overtones. It just meant that behaviors that happen in the light tend to be more ethical and more upstanding than behaviors that happen in the dark, because dark hides it. So just a little program note there. And so our final discussion. What do you think? Or what's?
I think Paul was pretty wise.
He was pretty
He
wise.
was pretty egotistical too, but nevertheless he was very wise in trying to teach the people.
In some ways, maybe I'm being defensive here for myself, but in some ways I think in order to exhibit that kind of charisma that's required when we were talking about those gifts, you at least got to have a healthy self-image.
Yeah.
It's hard to be self-loathing and be full of charisma at the same time. So it's not all bad. You just don't want to get carried away with it. What stands out to you as different from what you would expect from Paul? This is your first time. Is it different from what you expected?
I've been to pod groups previously, and that's more of what I expected. So this is definitely different than what I expected.
Right.
But it's still interesting and very educational.
Is Paul different from your traditional view of Paul and what you've heard tonight?
To be honest, I didn't have a great knowledge of Paul previously.
Okay.
But the only thing that stood out to Paul just on tonight's lesson, I would say, is that when he referenced the government so much, he went from love, 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 Jesus, then government, then right back to love. I thought that was that really stood out to me, because I've never dove into Paul so
Yeah.
much.
Cool, thanks. Anybody else? What's different in Paul than what you expect based on your traditional teaching, if you had one?
I think the openness of inclusiveness.
Okay. I was discussing, I'll stop here unless somebody wants to say something. I was discussing our course with Nancy Wilson this weekend, and she said, "What have you learned?" And so the points that I highlighted, which have somewhat surprised me or were different from what I expected, is number one, the inclusiveness of Paul. because I've been in that group of people that tended to use Paul to exclude. You had to follow these rigid sets of rules, or you were an outsider and to be treated like an outsider. And clearly, for example, tonight we hear Paul saying, show that godly love, that deep love that has action behind it, even to those people on the fringes. The second thing that surprised me about Paul was that if there is a concept of original sin, Paul lays that flatly on Adam, rather than the traditional patriarchal tendency to blame it all on Eve. So that surprised me. The third thing that surprised me a little bit is how this returning emphasis on how full of himself Paul was, that he really, and wasn't shy about pointing that out. I guess that's three. That's enough for now. But those are three things that surprised me. Any other observations? Okay. Remember, no Bible study next week because I'll be away. We'll have a final wrap-up session on September 5th. It'll be a busy one. And there's the good night animation of the night. I always show a good night picture at the end. So there's where we'll stop for now.